Okay, we're going to take a look here at a few introductory comments about the letter to the Romans. So Paul to the Romans, the date for the composition of this letter, somewhere between the mid-50s, when Paul was leaving Corinth to head for Jerusalem with the collection. The reference to taxes in Romans 13, 6-7 may allude to the questions of taxations that arose early in Nero's reign, and Paul is encouraging the believers not to be involved in any of the unrest or resistance to those new taxations. Recipients seem to be that they are both Jewish and Gentile Christians. Some have even speculated on the idea possibly Paul could be writing to non-Christian Jews. The separation between Judaism and Christianity, is not something that has really occurred at this time, and so Jewish Christians are interacting with other Jews, and Paul is seen as a Jew, and so Paul has relationships with Jews, and so he can be writing to Jews. And people who may know about Paul will read his letters, and so maybe some of this is directed towards those non-Christian Jews. But that is one speculation. It does seem that Jewish and Gentile Christians is pretty well agreed upon by many people. And so these Jewish and Gentile Christians belong to different mixtures, probably within several house churches. We get an indication of these house churches in the end part of Romans 16. So when you think about this letter, this is a letter that probably had to circulate to these different house churches, and a message from Paul to these Christians meeting in these houses. Maybe some were all Jews, maybe some were all Gentiles, maybe some were Jews and Gentiles meeting together. We do not know how the gospel came to Rome. Maybe by some who were in Jerusalem the day of Pentecost, Acts 2:10, or maybe the apostle Julia, Andronicus, who are mentioned in Romans 16:7. Maybe they brought the gospel to Rome. We don't know how it happened. If there are Jews who are becoming believers at first, and these Jews are traveling, and so Jews may have traveled to Rome, so this would be wealthier Jews involved maybe in some kind of commerce. And anyway, so there was a Jewish Christian community that was there, I guess, at least by the early 40s. Because by AD 49, there seems to be evidence of an expulsion from Rome by the Emperor Claudius, and he's responding to a situation that's happening based on the name of a Chrestus, which many scholars think is likely to be a mispronunciation or a misspelling of the name Christos. So that is the case. Then we would have Jewish believers who had been there. They had been expelled before AD 49. And then after Claudius dies, his edict is rescinded, and Jewish Christians are able to come back to Rome. Now, just very briefly then, looking here at the structure of the letter to the Romans, it does have a typical opening, a thanksgiving section. Those are typical of letter writing in the ancient world. We do have something that might act as like a thesis for the letter to the Romans, so kind of a presentation of the gospel and understanding the gospel and its implications. Not so much a focus on the story of Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, but the implications of what that death means for both Jews and Christians in their relationship towards God. So we have a kind of what you see is the main body, going from chapter 1:18 to chapter 15:13, and we have Jews and Gentiles are described as both being under condemnation because of sinfulness. Jews and Gentiles are both offered salvation by God through the same means, that is, through Christ's death. Then there's a diatribe on various related issues from chapter 6 all the way through chapter 8. Then there's the status of Israel. So that seems to be a question here, and it ties in really with the question of God's faithfulness. So if God is faithful, he has made a covenant with Israel. Is Paul now saying that that God has abandoned that covenant and is now going to start a new covenant? And if that was the case, if God could abandon the covenant he made with Abraham, does that mean he is unfaithful? So Paul is really trying to deal with that issue, since he now wants to see Gentiles as part of the people of God without them being circumcised. So how is that possible for them to be the people of God without doing those things that have traditionally marked the people of God? And then 12 through 15 is really how Jews and Gentiles can express their unity together. Paul then talks about his travel plans, particularly that he wants to go on to Spain. There are some greetings and closing remarks, and then finally a closeout with a prayer. We'll conclude this section, kind of a general introduction to Romans, with 3 purposes for this letter. One, it may have a kind of a missionary purpose, that is to announce his intentions to go to Spain and to evangelize Gentiles, and that there's going to be some kind of hope of financial support from the Romans. It also could be apologetic, to justify Paul's own understanding of the gospel, and especially defending his identity as an apostle who has been chosen by Christ. And so what we see then in that chapter 1, 16 and 17, we refer to as the kind of the thesis of it. We see that laying out this kind of apologetic. He's there to defend, to explain, and the use of his diatribe style in the letter. Now, for more information about the diatribe, I would reference you to the reading in De Silva, pages 604 and 605, where he talks about genre and structure. And there, in as he describes the diatribe, this is a rhetorical feature that is found in other sources of that time. And this is where the author tries to engage their audience through different kinds of presentation of information. So sometimes they may ask rhetorical questions. They're not looking for an answer. They already know what the answer is. They can ask legitimate questions. They can provide answers. They can also be in a dialogue with an imaginary person, kind of a straw man, if you like, or some kind of adversary, imagining some objections that somebody might put forward. So these are aspects, characteristics of what is sometimes referred to as a diatribe. So I would encourage you to continue to make sure you look at what De Silva says about that. And finally, there may be a pastoral purpose in this, and that is to heal the divisions that existed between possibly Jews, non-Christian Jews, Jewish Christians, and Gentile Christians, and make sure that they are kind of unified. What particularly may have happened is there was Jewish Christians before the edict by Claudius. There may have as well been Gentile Christians at that time. And when the edict came, Jewish Christians had to leave. Gentile Christians may not have had to. And so the Gentile Christianity continued to flourish or develop in the absence of these maybe more outspoken Jews, maybe kind of leaders within the Jewish Christian circles. And so when these Jewish Christians returned back, something of their superiority, something of their privileged status has been diminished. And so there may be a bit of tension now between Jewish Christians who feel that, well, this gospel is really a Jewish gospel. It comes from Israel's God. Jesus is a Jew. The first apostles were all Jewish, and therefore Israel stands in a preeminent place, whereas some Gentile Christians may have thought, well, the kind of preeminence of Israel or Judaism is now kind of gone. Now it's kind of opened, and Gentiles and Jews are on a kind of level playing field, and there may actually be a greater prominence for Gentile Christians who are accepting the gospel, and good things are happening amongst them, and they are growing. So there may have been something of a tension between that, and Paul hopes through this letter to address that tension.